All right, well, thank you everyone for coming to this panel. I just want to quickly say that I have been dreaming about this panel since about like 2019 or 2020, and I'm so excited that it's happening right now. So we'll get started first with introductions from our panelists. I guess I should probably introduce myself. My name is Norie Guthrie. I am an archivist and special collections librarian at Fondren Library in the Woodson Research Center at Rice University. And let's go ahead and get started. So we have Tara Damron. She is the program director of the White Hair Memorial Osage Resource Center. Tara is a member of the Osage Nation. Her background includes museums and archives with an emphasis on American Indian collections. We have Eva Ruth Moravec. She is the executive producer of CityCast Austin, which makes a daily podcast and newsletter to help people connect with the city. Moravec has produced several narrative nonfiction podcasts, including 3 for NBC Universal, along with an 11-episode series for Vox Media on the previously unreported history of Houston Police Department's Chicano Squad. She is an experienced reporter and frequent contributor to the Washington Post and has also freelanced for numerous local, state, and national publications. Moravec has also been a staffer with the Associated Press and the San Antonio Express News. In addition to reporting, she is also the executive director of a nonprofit, the Texas Justice Initiative, which provides data to the public on the Texas criminal justice system and serves as a resource for reporters, researchers, policymakers, and everyday Texans. And Wesley Phelps. He is an associate professor of history at the University of North Texas in Denton, where he teaches courses on recent U.S. history and queer history. His recent book, Before Lawrence v. Texas, The Making of a Queer Social Movement, was published by the University of Texas Press and won the Coral Horton Tullis Memorial Prize from the Texas State Historical Association for the best book on Texas history in 2023. He is also the creator of Queering the Lone Star State, a 10-episode narrative podcast series about the historic struggle for queer equality in Texas. Well, thank you for being here. All right, to get started with the first question, could you all take a moment to talk about the podcast that you created or were a part of, and what were they about? The first person that I see to the side of me is Eva, so we can start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us on, Norie, and for pulling this together. I was able to be a part of the Chicano Squad podcast, which was a story of a group of officers in Houston who were kind of tasked with this seemingly impossible job of solving a mounting pile of unsolved homicides among Latino Houstonians. So they got started in the late 1970s, and there was, it was amid a lot of civil unrest and police killings in Houston that had really affected minority communities in particular and disrupted a lot of the trust that police and Houstonians had. And so these officers were kind of promoted to homicide overnight and told that they had to solve these crimes. And they were incredibly successful and were around from 1979 until 2010. And so the story that I got to tell was about their job, what it was like for these Latino officers. They were all native Houstonians who, were kind of put in the middle of the city and police and residents and all the different types of crimes that they were investigating during those multiple decades. So it was, a true crime story and a hero story about these officers, very honest too about not everything went well. Of course, there were issues and they still faced a lot of discrimination and racism internally and externally and lots of challenges. So archives really helped me bring this story to life. I got to open boxes that hadn't been touched in many, many years, thanks to people like Norie for plugging me into the right places. And yeah, I'm really happy to be here to talk more about how archives really just told this story, and we couldn't have done it without that kind of access.
Thanks, Eva. Why don't we move on to, I never know how to address this. Would you like me to do Dr. Phelps, or would you like to
Of course
meet
not.
Wesley?
No,
That's what I figured, but I just wanted to make sure.
just call me Wes.
Okay, all right, Wes, and it is your turn to go.
Thanks, Norie. And again, thank you for the invitation to be on this panel with these wonderful content creators and researchers. I'm really excited to talk about my podcast. My podcast, Queering the Lone Star State, came out of a book that I published last year called Before Lawrence v. Texas, The Making of a Queer Social Movement, in which I document the struggle for gay and lesbian civil rights in Texas by centering legal activism against the state sodomy law. Many people might know that Texas had a sodomy law that criminalized same-sex sexual activity all the way until 2003. It wasn't until the Lawrence v. Texas Supreme Court decision finally invalidated that law, criminalizing the sexual lives of queer Texans. And so what I wanted to do with the book is look at the prehistory of Lawrence v. Texas. How did we get there? This case didn't just come out of nowhere. There was, several decades of grassroots activism and legal struggle against the Texas sodomy law that came before that. And so I wrote about those cases in my book going back to the late 1960s. And, the press, of course, didn't want an 800-page book. They're more interested in like a 300-page book. So I had a lot of material that didn't make it into the final book manuscript. And I started thinking about ways that I could get the other information out there. Normally what historians do is we publish journal articles in academic journals that very few people read when we have more material on a subject. And I just thought, well, I wonder if I could turn this into a podcast, because a lot of these stories, these legal cases are just fascinating. And I thought there might be an audience out there who would be interested in listening to stories about these cases. So what I ultimately produced with the help from a very generous media production grant from Humanities Texas is a 10-episode podcast series. Each episode takes one single case and really drills deep down into the details of that case. The great thing about podcasting, of course, is you can hear the voices of the individuals who are involved. That's sort of the part of the process that I enjoyed the most. And so we chronicle cases going back again to the late 1960s with Buchanan versus Batchelor, a challenge to a early iteration of a sodomy law, all the way through Lawrence v. Texas. And we have 2 episodes at the end of that series on Lawrence v. Texas. And so I'll stop there. But again, I'm happy to be here to talk more about this podcast.
All right, thank you, Wes. All right. Tara, could you talk about being a part of Interest and what Interest was about?
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. And it's really nice to be here with you all. Thank you to Norie for organizing this. Yeah, so a little bit about Interest. I actually didn't organize the podcast. I was contacted by essentially the reporter, Rachel Adams Heard, and she was with Bloomberg. And so I got a call actually from her and then from my personal attorney. She had reached out to him, and so he said, "Hey, I think you might, you should really talk to her." So we did, and she came out to Whitehair, and then she kind of told me what she was investigating or wanting to investigate. So really, the story of Interest, it focuses on a single family, a non-Indian family, that the Drummond family specifically, that how they came to the Osage Nation was that they were traders, Indian traders. And so they essentially set up a store in Hominy, Oklahoma, and that's sort of how they started to operate. But sort of the background behind all that is, where we are as far as being in Osage County and how we got here is that we as Osages purchased our reservation in 1872. We purchased it and had the title to it. So because of that, when the Dawes Act happened to a lot of the other tribes in Oklahoma, we weren't subject to that because of we had the title to our land. So lo and behold, pressure for allotment, statehood, all those sort of things culminate. And so what ends up happening is the Osages have what's called the 1906 Allotment Act. And that is sort of the document that essentially set up the surface land to being allotted. But what our leaders did was that they secured for the Osages and for the descendants of the lineal Osages, the mineral rights to be held in common in Osage County. So oil was discovered in the Osage about 1896, 1897. And so that was one of the things that our people and our leadership really wanted for us, because that was to provide a financial foundation for us as we were sort of making, a lot of that transition, from a nomadic way of life, having to adjust, assimilationist policies, all that sort of stuff. So some of you guys might be familiar with David Grant's book, Killers of the Flower Moon, which focuses specifically on what's sort of termed the Reign of Terror and the Osage murders. So what happens is that, Osage wealth, the oil just becomes sort of, we become sort of very, very, very wealthy. So the background of this is that the 1906 Act with the mineral rights. So what that happens is that Osages, there was a final roll, 2,229 Osages, and each original allottee received what they called a head right, which is essentially a share in the mineral estate. And then there was surface land. So there were 3 rounds of allotment. So each Osage received approximately 650-ish acres of surface land. So that's sort of the background of how all this, got started and where we are. So Rachel Adams Heard had gotten a tip about the Drummond family, and they're one of the largest landowners in Osage County. And so she wanted to understand how they acquired so much Osage land, and then also looking at Osage head rights. And so, she came to me and we met and we looked at resources here. And then, I told her about other Osage resources, for example, the Osage National Records in Fort Worth, Texas. And then, she asked about different community members and different ones that we might speak to. That's kind of the background of how all this got started. And, she did a lot of research, and I helped her over at the courthouse in Pawhuska going through land records. And then she also worked with, archivists down at Oklahoma City. And the thing about what Entrust did is that it uses a lot of material from the archive. So it actually uses interviews from the Drummonds themselves talking about how they use the store to basically, there's a term that's called Osage price, and basically just manipulate the prices to whatever they wanted. And so we were paying, ridiculous amounts for goods and things like that, which all of that is signed off on by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the agency. So the title of Entrust actually speaks to the fiduciary responsibility, i.e. the treaty responsibility that the United States government has to the Osage Nation. So that's why that's sort of the background of where that came from. And the thing about Entrust is that it's not just something that's happened in the past. It's something that what has happened in the past has led to what we as Osages are still fighting with, dealing with, and contending today, which is a loss of our head rights. held by non-Indians, which was never the intention of the 1906 Allotment Act. So this in trust specifically focuses on the Drummond family, how they acquired so much land, the means that they did it through manipulation, and, essentially it really gets into the nuts and bolts of the guardianship system, federal Indian policies. I mean, really like how this theft actually happened. So.
Thank you so much, Tara. I want to continue with you for a moment for the next question. As I assume, as I'm guessing the audience members here have listened to lots of podcasts. And usually archivists are like, there's the archives and someone enters the archives. And then maybe sometimes there's an archivist that might be named, or the anonymous archivist is sort of mentioned as helping or assisting or pointing someone towards something. But Tara, you really took an active role in that podcast. Not only as the, as a person presenting things, but also someone interpreting what was being seen. Did you expect to have that kind of a role, or did it just kind of come up organically?
No, thank you for that question. I did not expect that for that role to be I guess presented in the final product that way. So it did just happen organically. We had met, we had talked, and then she came along with her. She had some another staff person with her, and then we filmed. I say filmed. She recorded here, and so I appreciated her questions, and that she just sort of let me talk, and the way that the final product was done is that I think hearing that from community members who are a part of it, who had heard those stories from elders, and then the fact that this archival material actually validated those stories, right? And there it is in writing, there it is in black and white. So for me, it's because I am a member of the Osage Nation, and I grew up with this, and so I understand. It's definitely personal for me, but it was also an opportunity to express our side of the story, which so often has never been heard, and has never been vocalized and except amongst ourselves. And so I think the power of what In Trust did was to really let our voices, Osage voices, be heard. And then the other side of that is that through the archives, she used the actual interviews of the Drummonds themselves, and so it's in their own words. It's not being interpreted through someone else. And so I think that in and of itself is very powerful, so I was thankful for that opportunity. And it's been a really good thing to be a part of.
All right, thanks, Tara. So Wesley and Eva, can you talk about the roles you took with your podcasts, Chicano Squad and Queering the Lone Star State?
Eva, why don't you go? You go first.
All right, I was trying to pass it to you. For Chicano Squad, it was kind of all over the place. I had never done a podcast before. I've been a reporter and covered a lot of criminal justice and government, and dealt with a lot of open records and things like that. So there was a company in California that had kind of stumbled across a mention of the Chicano Squad in a news article from the 80s, and just reached out and was like, can you look into this? Is this worth a podcast? Because there was really nothing written about them at that time. There was a book chapter, part of a book chapter in a self-published Houston police book. And so I started to go to Houston. I live in Austin. I started to go to Houston and start digging through different archives. Was my first stop through the Houston Public Library, and reading news articles and digging into anything I could find that mentioned the Chicano Squad. Then it was like, okay, yeah, this is definitely worth a podcast. There's a lot in here. They were around for so long. They had such a huge impact on the Latino community, and changed people's lives, like gave people, safety that didn't have access to it, honestly, because there weren't even Spanish speaking homicide detectives at Houston Police Department before the Chicano Squad existed. So not even to have anybody to talk to that, could understand your safety concerns. So that's where it started. And then I did, I found a lot of the guys that had been involved in the Chicano Squad over the years. The original members, did a lot of interviews with several of them. And that was me, sitting at their kitchen tables with a recorder. So I was going to archives, digging everything I could find about, how to basically, it was kind of back and forth. Like the guys would tell me a story, and I'm a journalist and I wanted everything to be very fact-based, so then I would take the few details that they could remember and file an open records request, or go back to an archive and see if I could find a date from, news coverage from that date. So I was trying to supplement their stories, or to back them up with actual records from somewhere. So it was a lot of back and forth trying to figure out where we could, how to frame the episodes. We ended up basically finding like one case per episode that was sort of telling of Houston at that time, or crime trends, or something interesting, some kind of peg. And yeah, so I did all of the records requests and sifted through all of that, and the interviews and the archives, and I wrote the scripts. I did not narrate the episodes. We had a narrator, Cristela Alonso, who was fabulous, and we're really grateful that she wanted to be a part of it. And yeah, I wrote the scripts, and then after Cristela would record them, sometimes things would change. So I would fact check everything at that point. And it's hard to fact check people's personal recollections, but I did my best, or their feelings. But yeah, so I was kind of involved with the whole thing from soup to nuts, and really enjoyed it. I mean, I felt like it was really my story, and very, I fell in love with, these guys who were willing to share so much of their lives, the boxes of letters that people would share with me, thank you notes that the squad received over time. Just some really incredible stuff that would have been hidden. I did not, unfortunately, get to partake in the rights signing process. And so the Chicano Squad story is being made into several TV shows and movies that I am not a part of. But I know that my work was like the foundation for that, whether it's fiction, the product is fictional or not. I got to be the first shot at that history. So that was kind of my role with Chicano Squad.
Thanks,
Yeah.
Eva.
In a similar way, I had not done a narrative podcast before. At my previous institution at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, a colleague and I had started a podcast that was just an interview show. If somebody had a new book come out, we would interview them for 45 minutes about their new book. But I always loved narrative podcasts, things like This American Life. I really like things like Radio Lab. There's a Radio Lab spinoff called More Perfect about the Supreme Court. Jill Lepore has a great podcast called The Last Archive, where they really draw you into these stories from history. And so I knew I wanted to make something like that, but I had no idea how to do it. In fact, at the beginning of the process, I just Googled, how do you make a narrative podcast? Got a little bit of an education there. But it was when I got the grant and I started hiring people who knew what they were doing. That's when I started really learning how to do it. So I was able to hire a producer, Sarah Lingholm, who was fantastic. I cannot imagine the podcast being what it is today without her. This is just as much her project as it is mine. She knew all of the stuff that I didn't know about, all of the technical things. Like she was able to just be in control of all of that. And I could devote my time to writing really good scripts, scheduling interviews with people, conducting the interviews, and kind of assembling these stories. And something that really surprised me is when we got into the studio, I told Sarah that when I hired her, she was a student at the time, not in my department, but in another department. I said, I really need someone who's going to be able to tell me when I have a bad idea or when something I want to do isn't going to work. I need someone who is going to be able to tell me that and not be intimidated. And she assured me that she could, and she did, that she had no problem with that. There were times in the studio where I had written a draft of what I thought was just a great, fascinating episode, and we would get 3 paragraphs in, and she would say, "This is boring as hell. Like no one is going to want to listen to this. It sounds like you're reading a paper at an academic conference. Right? Nobody's going to listen to that." So we did a ton of rewriting of our scripts in the studio with Sarah's input, which was just really amazing. And then I was also able to hire some research assistants who could kind of help. The first thing I had them help on was locating interview subjects, which again was just really fantastic. They had ways of finding people that I wasn't even aware of. One individual we were searching for was a woman named Mary Jo Risher, who had the custody of her children revoked in 1975 just because she was a lesbian. And she had become a national kind of figure for queer parental rights, someone who had been wronged by the courts. She wrote a memoir about it. They made a TV movie about her story. And then around 1978, she just disappeared from public view. And I couldn't find her anywhere. I mean, I looked through all the channels I could, and my research assistant came in one day and she said, I think I found Mary Jo Risher on Reddit. Found this Reddit thread that says she's living on a remote island off the coast of Washington State, and she runs a little touristy fudge shop there, and has changed her name, but I think this is her. And so I was able to find this, the old person that I am, I was then able to find the person under her new name on Facebook. Contacted her on Facebook, and she said, "Yes, I am Mary Jo Risher. I'd be happy to do an interview." It was the most powerful interview we conducted for the entire series. And it would not have happened had it not been for those research assistants. So again, I was the project director for this, but it took a lot of people for all of that to kind of come together.
So do you think that each of you can talk about your relationships with archivists? And then also, and perhaps Tara, if you feel like you can explore it some more, your relationship with the Entrust podcasters? And we can start with, why don't we start with Tara?
Sorry about that. Sure. Yeah, so, when you do things like this, you never sort of really know how this is going to turn out. And you just, you sort of just hope for the best but what ended up happening was that, I really came to respect Rachel and then her team, and then also another reporter, journalist, Allison Herrera, who was very much involved with the Interest podcast, and she appears on some of the later episodes, or you hear her on some of the later episodes. But the thing about it is that what I realized is that, okay, this is someone who's really committed to this project, who is really willing to sort of be in for it, you know, the long haul of whatever this is. And I you know, I guess that's the reporter side of her, you know, wanting to get the Osage perspective, the Drummond's perspective, you know, possibly other perspectives, you know, from, you know, sort of all around these issues. And so it's been a really fulfilling thing, and I'm you know, proud to actually call them friends and colleagues, you know. And the thing about Allison is that she has continued to report and be a part of the Osage community in her work as far as Indigenous affairs reporting. And then we had an opportunity, the Osage News wanted to host a panel. And so a lot of our community members, I think we had around 200 people show up over at Pawhuska Wake and Iron at the community building. And so Rachel, Allison, myself, and then John Maker, who appears, or you hear him in one of the episodes talking about, you know, his mother and that relationship with, you know, their interaction with the Drummond store and the Osage Price, and, you know, all that sort of stuff. We got a chance to sort of talk about all of that. And so it was really sort of amazing, because what the podcast has done is that it's accessible in a way that I think is very appealing to young people. I mean, you can just, you know, Google it wherever you get your podcasts. And so what has happened is that so many people said, I didn't know about this, or I didn't understand this, or yeah, we had heard that, but, you know, now this, you know, for it to really be out there. And so not just for us, but for the world or the community to really understand what was happening. And also that, you know, it's really been engaging for young people too. And I think it's given a lot of people the ability to vocalize so much of this, because for so many years, a lot of this just wasn't talked about, you know, except amongst ourselves. So it's really been interesting to see sort of the impact of that and what's happened. And you know, it's exciting.
Eva, well, Wes, it looks like you've unmuted, so.
Sure,
Yeah.
I can go next. Yeah, I worked with many archivists across the state and across the country, on both on the book, but also on the podcast. Morgan Geringer, who is the head of special collections here at the University of North Texas, was absolutely indispensable, and she was such a huge supporter of this project. Mostly because of her efforts, we have the largest LGBTQ history archival collection in the Southwest here at UNT. So it was really nice just to be able to walk across campus and have access to those materials. We have Morgan's voice is in the podcast several times, where Sarah and I just walk over to the archive, and Morgan walks us through some of the historical documents that we used to tell some of these stories, which are really some of the greatest moments of the podcast. That was really fun. There are archivists at the Briscoe Center down at UT Austin. I worked with archivists at the Texas State Library and Archives. But there were archivists at Harvard Special Collections, where we found some archival audio that we wanted to use. The Studs Terkel radio archive that exists, their archivist helped us because Mary Jo Risher, who I mentioned before, went on the Studs Terkel radio hour to talk about her experience. And so they allowed us to use some of their archival audio. And that was really great. You know, we asked to use the archival audio mostly for free. We had a tiny little budget we could use for permissions, but mostly we were looking for free access. Most archives and archivists were willing to let us use this for free. We have a local NBC affiliate in Dallas. We have their video archive here at UNT. That usually, I think the special collections usually charge us somewhere around $100 a second to use that. Morgan gave us full access to that archive for free. So we were able to use so much of that. So, again, I talked about the assistants I was able to hire. The archivists that I worked with on this project were also really critical for the success of the podcast.
I guess that's me. Yeah, the archivists that I worked with were incredibly helpful, from helping me find a research assistant who helped me sift through a bunch of records and was there locally in Houston to go and grab things. I mean, it was really actually an eye-opening experience for me. I'd been a journalist for a while and I was very familiar with public records, but I actually didn't know much about archives at all. And it was just so exciting to find out about all these treasures that were just everywhere, and the variety of places that archives can come from, from somebody's personal collection of holiday cards to newspapers and all of these official records, but just the variety of things that are archived, I think was really incredible for me to find out about. And I just felt like I had tapped this new level, it's all these doors start opening. And I think in journalism, we're used to finding the people who are the records custodians and sort of trying to interest them in the project that you're doing so that they might be able to help you. Not every relationship with a records custodian is going to be like that, but there is a potential, in my opinion, and a good place to start is always the benefit of the doubt, and just trying to tell somebody in general what you're going for, because it's not always where you think it is. So I think I had that same kind of approach when I started going into archives and really trying to find stuff. It was who can I reach out, who can I lean on that knows where these things are and knows the right places to search for them. And so I just tried to be very polite and friendly and appreciative of everyone's time, follow the rules, make sure I didn't bring things to the wrong places or use anything I wasn't supposed to. Yeah, I mean, I was at all the universities and colleges in Houston, at the public library, definitely whenever I would find out, a Houston former mayor's archives were at whatever college he graduated from. It's okay, who's there? Yes, quite a bit at the Fondren facility for Lee P. Brown, I believe. So yeah, I tried to be very, thankful to them also in the credits and make sure that we, mention people by name and by facility. So yes, thank you. Michaela, yes, I remember that name. That was really helpful to me, I think, was getting people excited about the project and kind of on my team to try to help me tell this story with things that only archivists knew where to find. So I think that experience really kind of changed my future experiences working on podcasts, because now I know that that's where a lot of stuff can be and just the potential. And so I'm always telling reporters who are looking for things, or podcast producers, to tap into that their resources as well, and just expand their minds on where things might be.
Okay, all right. I think we have a time for one more question. I guess how has the podcast affected its intended community or audience? Or if you already feel like you've sort of answered that one, you could also chip in something about your favorite item that you think was really integral for the podcast. And so, and I guess, Tara, do you want to start first?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, I would say that the podcast has really had a tremendous impact on the Osage community, both young and old alike, and that it's also had an impact on the world. I think the attention that David Grann brought with his book released in 2017, Scorsese's movie that came out in Killers of the Flower Moon. I think the ability and what In Trust does is that it actually gets into the nuts and bolts of, you know, how this happened, what was happening. And it goes back to the importance of what we do as archivists and the importance of this type of material, you know, and because it speaks to that human experience, it speaks to the historical record. And so from that perspective, it's been really powerful, you know, is what I can say about that. And I guess I guess I would just mention something from an archival object, I guess, would be the newspaper list that came out in 2009. So that was it was a court-ordered list, but it was published in the Big Heart Times, and that was a list of all non-Osage headright holders. And so in the very first episode 1 of In Trust, it's titled The List. And so from 1906 until 2009, that list had been basically kept hidden by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so for that to make its public debut was really instrumental and really powerful amongst the Osage community. So I think that was a really powerful way to sort of kick off this story.
Thanks, Tara. Eva, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I think a lot of the impact of Chicano Squad, and this is probably like an idealistic, silly view, is just that it gave this time some validity, or people's experience, you know, that they actually did go through this, that things were really tough in Houston at that time, especially for Latinos, and that there were a lot of civil rights issues that needed to be dealt with, and that we got to get into those. I mean, the series starts with the death of Jose Campos Torres, who was a Vietnam veteran whose body was found in the bayou in Houston after he had been beaten by police. And so that's kind of, you know, it wasn't the only thing that kicked off the need for the Chicano Squad, but I think like I heard, you know, I got to hear recordings from some of the meetings, the community meetings that happened after that death, and of other mothers talking about their sons being killed in encounters with law enforcement. And so just kind of having that part of history no longer glossed over and no longer lost, I think was a big impact for me. There was one story that I loved that was a young woman was kidnapped from her home. Her parents basically like had the doors open one evening. This woman wandered in. She needed a place to stay. They let her stay. This couple had a young baby. I think she was like 2 or 3 at the time. And, you know, she spent the night, they fed her, and the next morning the baby was gone. And this was around the same time as baby Jessica fell in the well in Midland, which was like the story that everyone was covering and got so much attention. And they knew where the child was. The child had like fallen into a well in her aunt's backyard. Meanwhile, Liliana in Houston was the young girl's name. She was just actually kidnapped and taken out of the country. She was in Mexico with this woman, and Houston police, the Chicano Squad guys, ended up going down to rescue her, and they saved her from this woman. And it was like this really incredible, heroic story that didn't get any recognition at the time. And so I found her, I wrote her, I found some addresses that I thought might be where she lived. And so I wrote her letters after like finding some of her story in the archives. And I got to like hear what that was all like for her and her mother. And that, I guess I just felt like that was a telling impact, that like it gave her the space to be like, yes, this did happen to me. And it was crazy. And it was at the same time as this like missing white girl got, you know, national attention, even though everyone knew where she was. She was in this hole. Again, that's my idealistic perspective of it, but I like to think that I was able to give people a chance to tell these stories that, you know, validated what they had gone through, and just kind of give all of that some space.
Yeah, you know, we've heard from a lot of different kinds of people about queering the Lone Star State. You know, the audience we were trying to reach was mostly a non-academic audience. So people who wouldn't ordinarily pick up a history book, or who wouldn't pick up a history book about queer history. We thought we could reach them with a podcast like this. And we did. We heard from a lot of people who they would write in on our website saying like, I just had never heard of this before. I had no idea that these cases existed. I had no idea that there was this long history of activism. And I guess that's generally true of a lot of young activists in particular, is they often think they are the pioneering generation of activists on a particular issue. And so we heard from a lot of young people saying, we had no idea that there was this long history, and that there are still elders in our community who were part of that struggle, who are still around, that we could have communication with, who we don't. So that was really gratifying. And then we got some other feedback through email from people who would say things like, we have an episode about the case Baker versus Wade, and the plaintiff in that case was a man named Don Baker, a gay man from Dallas who filed suit in the late 70s against the Texas sodomy law, and really became kind of the image of the gay rights movement in Texas for several years. He died from cancer in 2000, and we had one person email us saying he had been very close friends with Don Baker up until he died, and he had not heard his voice until he heard it on the podcast. And it was a really kind of emotional moment for him. So it's really nice to get that kind of feedback from the audience for this. And just real quick on your question about an piece of something from the archive that really stood out. One of the things that we have here at UNT are, well, so let me back up. We have an episode about the raid on the Village Station nightclub in Dallas in the late 70s. You know, this is 10 years after Stonewall. Gay bars are still being raided by police. And they arrested 10 men from the Village Station that night. So we got the arrest records here in the archive at UNT, and reading these arrest records, I mean, to read a police officer describing what he saw in a gay bar is sometimes tragic, but often really funny. I mean, describing people as you know, they arrested people for public lewdness. So they would say things like, oh, the defendant was dancing with his buttocks rubbing against the accomplice's genital area. And it's like, yeah, that's dancing. So it's just really funny. And we have that. In fact, we have Morgan reading some of those arrest reports in the podcast. So finding stuff like that in the archive is really, really fun.
All right, thank you. We will go ahead and take one of our first questions. And if you want to ask any questions of the panelists, please feel free. The first one is from Amanda Foki. Do you have any suggestions for archivists who have ideas for podcast topics that they want to send out to the world to inspire a person to come in and do the research, build a narrative? Anybody want to take that one on?
I guess I'll give it a shot. I would just say, like, if they're, you could approach it in a couple ways. You could either say, like, if you're hearing a podcast that sort of spurs an idea that you're like, oh, I have something similar to this, you could reach out to the people who made that podcast, or similarly, like, find a reporter who, even, whatever medium they might be working in, whether it's TV or print or audio. I think that there's a lot of interest in podcasts still. I know that there was the bubble and people think that it's over. I still think it's just such a powerful form of storytelling, and especially true stories, I think are really sought out. So I would say, like, directly reach out to a reporter or a writer who's, like, already in that kind of area or doing something similar.
Yeah, and I think students are also a good target for that. Some of the most exciting podcasts I've listened to recently have been made by students. Last semester, I taught a class on Texas queer history, and the students produced a 6-episode series about the history of Oak Lawn in Dallas. That's Dallas's neighborhood. So you might reach out to students or to faculty, or even high school teachers who might want to do a class project on something like that. Because I think students, like Eva said, students are still very much interested in podcasting. I assign podcasts in some of my classes, and the students always are excited about that.
I guess to follow up on that, I would say maybe possibly reach out to some of your community members wherever you are. And so maybe there's, some feedback or things like that, but that might be another avenue to sort of bounce ideas off of. And but yeah.
Let's see. The next question I have is, do you have some resources for podcast creation? I guess I'm a little confused about what's being asked, but perhaps if that would be tools, technology, that kind of thing.
Well, I think one thing that's great about the moment that we're in is that the technology is not cost prohibitive. So yes, ideally, you want to be in a professional studio with professional equipment, but that's really the ideal. You can make a podcast for very little money, just buying a fairly decent USB microphone online. And there are all kinds of recording tools that you can use. For my class last semester, we used Audacity, which is a free open source audio recording and editing software that would pretty much do everything you need to do to create a podcast. So, $100 microphone and a relatively soundproof closet in your home or in your apartment, and a laptop with a free software, you could make a podcast that sounds pretty good. And there are all kinds of online resources for using these tools and using them well. As I said, my first instinct was to Google how to make a narrative podcast. Several websites had tutorials. There are great YouTube videos from podcasters explaining how to use a microphone, how to speak into a microphone, how to do all of those kinds of things. So the tools are out there and relatively inexpensive.
Anybody else on answering that one?
I guess I'd just add to, like, kind of to also listen to podcasts. That seems obvious, but like know what and try to pick them apart a little bit. Think about like what elements are compelling as a listener. And then also just try it out. I mean, even on your phone, you can record audio, you can, especially like field recording, you can go out and just listen, like, think about things from a more audio perspective, I guess. And just try it. I think a lot of, I didn't know how to use any recording equipment when I started working on Chicano Squad, and there was an engineer on the team who helped me quite a bit, but a lot of it was just like using the equipment and just trying it, holding a microphone and going out and trying to and listening in the earphones as to what trips up that, what it picks up, and just being familiar with like how the equipment works. I think you can try a lot without like having to make anything necessarily, and just be familiar with it.
All right, thank you. We have another question. This is for Tara. Has Intrust inspired future audio projects or collaborations with OHS or other Oklahoma organizations?
Not so far as that I'm aware of, but I think that the potential for that, is there. So thank you to Wesley and Eva for giving background on how to do the content, the technical side of that. So I think I guess the idealistic hope is that people can take what Intrust did and what Intrust was able to bring to light, and then expand on that and just encourage that. So as of yet, there hasn't been anything in the works that I'm aware of, but I think it's we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Who knows? So.
All right. Thank you. And then I have a question, because I don't have another question lined up yet. I will say that there's a lot going on in the chat, and that would include Aaron, I hope I don't mess up your last name, Sood, from the Dallas Morning News, research editor there and head of the archive, saying that there's a lot of untapped material there. And then also there's suggestions about, podcasts, acquiring like podcast equipment and microphones, and using TikTok to find help with that. And then also, HP, Houston Public Library, I was about to say HPL. Houston Public Library has tech link branches, and I know that some libraries and academic institutions do have little digital media centers that might have a good recording space that could be booked. So there could be options to try to get connected with kind of more higher grade equipment, and hopefully for free. Free is always good. So, and then I guess I don't have any more questions, or from the audience, but I have another question that I can ask. And then what do you see as the advantage of using a podcast format to tell a story rather than rather than print media or etc.?
Well, I think hearing the voices of people from the past, I'm a historical podcaster, to be able to hear those voices, I think is really important. Because it's one thing for me, because I wrote a little bit about Mary Jo Risher's case in my book. And so it's one thing to read a few pages about that case. It's something quite different to hear Mary Jo Risher talk about how devastated she was when the jury read that verdict that said she was an unfit mother because she was a lesbian. I mean, to hear her describe what she was going through in that moment is so much more powerful than anything that I could have written. So I think that's the biggest advantage.
Tara, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah, I can do that. No, I would agree with Wesley there. There is something about hearing voices, because what that can communicate is emotion, is feeling, is depth, is dimension, all of those things. And so it's really powerful, as opposed to just reading it on a piece of paper or in a book or in an exhibit or something, because it sort of creates this sensory experience for the listener. And I think there's something really powerful about being able to hear it in someone else's, in their words, as opposed to, that being interpreted. So it's also really accessible, right? I mean, you don't have to physically go to a place or, buy the book or that type of thing. I mean, you can just, while you're working, if you've got headphones. And so I think that's the other thing that's really just intriguing, is that the accessibility as a.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think audio is just very immersive, and it like relays people's emotions, I think, a lot better than obviously print, for sure. And even TV, I mean, I think just being focused on the sounds of something, it's a little bit of a slower, like sensory experience, maybe, if that makes sense. It's not like you're getting hit by all these images and you're, focusing on different things. It's like you can really just kind of, I don't know, be stuck on one thing. And I think people's voices really do show emotion and give you a layer that someone describing that to you doesn't provide. I worked on this podcast with NBC about the Republican Revolution of 1994. And it was also around the start of, our time period started around when C-SPAN began. And that was a really exciting thing to be able to bring in. Like, just, you can hear so much from people's emotional floor speeches and in press conferences, like you can tell when they're stressed or when they're upset or crying. And I just think that, like, it's, yeah, you get to like take it in a slower kind of way, I think, if that makes sense.
Okay, we have another question that has popped in, and I have not been doing this, but I know that there's this kind of the new thing of making podcasts, like video recording your podcast and then putting it on YouTube. Do you have any opinions or preferences for that kind of new thing, or even like how people might use snippets of podcasts on social media, that kind of thing?
I have a potentially controversial take. For all of the reasons I just listed, I am opposed. I think that it detracts from the audio story. And I think you can use audio in social media. They're called audiograms, I think, where you take like a snippet of audio. I think that could be very powerful, but I just feel like when you add the images on top of that, it takes away from this very powerful medium.
I agree with that. I really, Eva, I love what you said about just how sound when we're only engaging with sound, we respond to things differently. I mean, you hear things differently when you don't have a visual to go with it. I mean, I think too often in media, we rely too much on visual to tell stories. And in a podcast, you can't do that. So you have to really be able to tell a story. So I think that's great. I'm also very much against the 1.5 and the 2x listening, because as Eva said, this is it's a slower medium. You're supposed to be able to take time to digest what's happening. So we're talking about things we don't like. I don't like that either.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just comment that I think the real power of podcasts is exactly what it is. It's that audio experience, and in a way, it allows us to sort of shut down, right? So we're not distracted and detracted, and so there's always that I guess tension and ability to say, oh, well, we could do this or we could do that. But then it's like, are we losing what it is that, that's the really powerful source of this medium? So that's, I would, question that.
All right. Are there any other kind of final comments that the panelists have before we wrap this up? Any kind of famous last words?
Thank you. I would like to say thank you to Tara and Wes for their amazing work in bringing history to life in this way. I think it's really hard to do this work, and it's very valuable and important for our humanity. So thank you. And thank you, Norie, for bringing us together, and all the archivists for keeping things that we might need.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. It's really what an honor to be here with Eva and Tara. And I would say that if you are an aspiring podcaster out there, just do it. I mean, like Eva was saying, give it a try. See what you can create.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eva and Wes and Norie. This has been amazing, and it's just so nice for all of us to know that what we've been able to do is to bring to light things that we didn't know that before, or it wasn't well known. And so I think that's what we do as archivists. It's just so important, and it does matter. These things matter.
I agree with all of that. I think everybody on the panel, I'm so glad that this has finally happened. And I hope the audience enjoyed it. And I guess what's coming next, I think, is the kind of the wellness thing that's happening around noon. Please enjoy that. And you all will probably be seeing me on Friday at the board meeting. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Norie.
Thanks.
Well done.
Thank you,
made it
Norie.
happen.
Good
Thank you,
job.
Norie. This was great.